just to make it clear, so comparative alterity. And I think this one has a lot to do with the revitalization of, which is very strong today in anthropology, the classic questions and issues of anthropology, of anthropological traditions. That means focusing on particular kind of subject matters, having certain ranges of interest. That was now much productive ethnography on contemporary assemblages is being produced by the key classic virtue and technique of anthropological analysis of making it strange, partly by the broad comparative commitments of the discipline, and partly by the exemplary and sophisticated creation of analytic frames of this kind. There's a lot of intellectual energy in this now, so it's good. For pedagogy and illustration, anthropology has always played with exercises such as juxtaposing the doctor and the shaman, for example. But the comparative use of material and concepts developed in anthropology's historic and continuing ethnographic archive of world peoples and cultures in the ethnography of contemporary assemblages is strong, vigorous, and perhaps motivated by what I like to call a revitalization movement in the discipline, which seeks to restore or reinstantiate its founding concerns. This style has been pioneered, I think, here in Brazil, but in this piece that I wrote, and most acutely and prominently practiced by Marilyn Strathern, in my opinion, and several others, but I mentioned her here. And by now has created a defined circle of mutual reference and practice in ethnography that is linked to revitalizing concepts such as animism, the gift, and the past and ongoing study of ritual and exchange systems generally as a source of theory, ideas, and analytic frames for application to understanding, say, reproductive technologies, digital and intellectual property, and many business topics such as innovation, advertising, etc. The spirit, however, is to revitalize anthropology and its historic questions rather than an ethnography of the contemporary. So I think in this field of conversations with business executives or with scientists is less collegial, is less co-epistemic partnership and more like framing a certain kind of theoretical interest and investigation. I think this work in anthropology linked to a similar sensibility in the analyses of influential actor network theory, spawned by the research projects of Bruno Latour, first in science study, but now applied more broadly, consider the key role of actants and the revival of interest in animism in styles of ethnographic alterity that I want to identify. This style focuses primary attention on novel and emerging ontologies for which analogies to older anthropological concepts are well suited, and pays far less attention to epistemological questions which were at the core of the emergence of the current project of critique that encompasses so much present anthropological research. In its reclamatory tendency, this style of ethnography, while creative in its exposure of new ontologies, is self-consciously a departure from the project of critique of the past 2 decades. For example, it might like to forget Foucault for a while and perhaps revive the discussions around the work of Levi-Strauss. Now, second is reflexive critique. I use this term to refer to a style of ethnographic work that has flourished since the so-called theory period of the 1980s into the early 1990s, of which writing culture, anthropology is cultural critique, the work I'm personally associated with was just a part. Across disciplines that study culture and consider various forms of critique as the core practice of their research traditions. In anthropology, this period gave rise to many angles, tendencies, and theory sect, like religious sects, theory sect. But its practice richly continues in a so-called, as I mentioned, reflexive turn, where the work of ethnography is theoretically framed in terms of a long history of critical theory and philosophy that remains its primary conceptual source. It is also very interested in the new ontologies of assemblages, but does not de-emphasize epistemological questions that has shaped the predominant paradigm of critical research in recent anthropology. The contemporary is engaged and negotiated by ethnographers in constant dialogue with this theory tradition as a source of creating new analytic concepts, like those that come more from biology than culture. So to some degree, biological concepts and analogies have displaced the fascination with traditional fascination with culture theory. And there is hope and occasionally experiments in this style through ethnographic fieldwork to contribute to the increased self-critical reflexivity of organizations, institutions, and processes in which the fieldwork is undertaken. Very often the critique is a critique not in the general it offers a critique that would increase kind of reflexive thinking, not in the general public sphere, but in the assemblages in which these projects now operate. Equally important are the relation and contribution of ethnography at the level of applied analytics, so to speak, to the great, mostly Western traditions of critical social theory and philosophy. Alterity, that is emerging novel ontologies on a global scale, is a disciplinary concern here as well, but the intellectual resources of this style derive less from the tradition of concepts that anthropology itself has pioneered, and more from continued involvement in the rich revival of critical theory itself in recent decades, and its continuing vitality in research programs and applications like critical ethnography. So the concern of the trend of cultural critique is to in some way save and expand the tradition of Western and fit into the tradition of Western in its present prospects. Whereas for comparative alterity, it's really interested in the well-keeping of the traditional classic questions of anthropology. But what's involved really is a kind of sense of revitalization. Okay, the third one, and the one I like, is a bit eccentric. It's alignment with the found para-ethnographic. This style is an offshoot, perhaps, a more eccentric and experimental one of this style of reflexive critique, which I just outlined. It goes very deep, so to speak, for its concepts, and even its rationale as ethnographic research, into its relations with particular subjects, and the politics of these relations, before it resurfaces and returns to or reintegrates with disciplinary history and traditions of question asking and argument making specific to anthropology. That's why I emphasize that primary data becomes the material that you want to expose to the discussion of anthropologists and interested others. And my argument is that in fieldwork of the contemporary tradition, we don't have these forms to do this. We kind of present our representations of those discussions. Whereas I think that anthropologists in particular projects at certain moments, at certain points, have to be integrated literally into the field. And you need kind of forms of intervention in order to do this. And so the center is very much devoted to the exploration and experimentation with the introduction of such forms alongside or inside particular projects of ethnography. This found para-ethnographic is premised on the idea that any line of critique that anthropology or its interdisciplines think of and through in the academic sphere has its embedded parallel expressions and anticipations in the multi-site scene of contemporary fieldwork itself, though not necessarily as obviously as characterizing a readily discernible native point of view of one particular actor or subject, and that ethnography best proceeds by creating concepts for itself, by finding and engaging with such found, and this is the term para-ethnographic thinking, wherever it is found, what it is found, whatever is found forms. This is very much the epistemological integrated with the novel and the ontological that the Alteridade style so values. Its special problems are the politics of association and the strategies of recursive movement in a field which crosses both expert and non-expert knowledge-making endeavors. It is the style most challenged by the imperatives of collaboration in assemblages, to become part of them while retaining a sphere of independent inquiry. So it's not doing applied anthropology, it's not working within the trajectories of the assemblage, but it's maintaining a kind of independent presence within it. Its key interest is in basing eventual ethnographic results reported to the academy or the university or the department on alignment and collaboration with found critical perspectives and their translation and processing while doing fieldwork. This raises novel questions of the forms of scholarly communication that exceed their conventional framings as problems of theory or method. Instead, there is a commitment to a kind of experimental practice with which, I'm not sure he's read here very much, Hans-Georg Reinberger, who's a scientist just retired in Berlin, who works in the history of science. In his probing of it and has studied experiment in science, rethought experiment in scientific method. Anyhow, there's a commitment to a kind of experimental practice with what Hans-Georg Reinberger, in his probing of experiment in scientific method, has called epistemic things. Epistemic things.